Welcome back to Medieval Times Archive, where history isn't just written in ink, but in blood, fire, and wings. From the medieval age to the modern era, there exists a tiny creature that once brought entire kingdoms to their knees. No swords, no armies, just wings, teeth, and endless hunger. Locusts, the green armies of destruction. In the 13th century, terrified peasants looked up and saw the sun vanish behind a blackened sky. What followed wasn't just a failed harvest, it was mass starvation, chaos, and the burning of entire fields in desperation. Priests called it divine punishment. Villagers blamed witches. And yet, no one could stop the swarm. Fast forward to the 21st century, and they're still here. In 2020, East Africa faced the worst locust plague in decades, with swarms as large as cities devouring crops in minutes. Even with satellites and drones, mankind remains humbled by this ancient threat. Are they a punishment from the heavens, a symptom of climate change, or simply nature, reminding us of our fragility? Tonight, we uncover a story older than empires. This is the tale of the locusts, nature's quiet apocalypse. The locust plague in the Middle Ages, a time of fear, fire, and faith. In the Middle Ages, knowledge of nature was limited, and fear of the unknown was immense. When the skies darkened and the buzzing hum of wings filled the air, peasants didn't see an ecological phenomenon. They saw a sign from God, or worse, a curse. As swarms of locusts descended upon medieval farmlands, people turned to the only explanations they knew: divine punishment or demonic influence. Entire villages gathered in churches, praying day and night. Bells were rung in desperation, not celebration. Monks fasted, flagellants whipped themselves in repentance, and clergy declared days of mass penance. "The Lord is angry," they said, "and the locusts are his sword." In some regions, stories spread of Chow Chow, the green devils from the east. These winged invaders were said to be sent by Satan himself, riding on winds from cursed lands. Medieval art even depicted them with tiny horns or glowing red eyes, merging biblical imagery with folklore. Superstition quickly turned deadly. When crops vanished overnight and grain silos stood empty, blame needed a face. Women, especially those living alone or practicing herbal medicine, were accused of witchcraft. "She called them," villagers whispered. "She feeds them with spells." Trials followed. So did executions. It wasn't uncommon for a woman to be burned alive, her ashes scattered on the fields in hopes the locusts would vanish with her soul. Entire communities took drastic action. In desperation, villagers set fire to their own fields. Better to lose the crops to fire than watch them eaten alive. The smoke was thought to repel the insects. Sometimes it worked. Most times, it only worsened the famine. And still, the locusts came. Chronicles from the 14th century described terrifying scenes. A monk in northern Italy wrote, "The sky grew thick and dark, and the sun was blotted out as though swallowed by the end of days. The sound was like hailstones on rooftops, but it was the beating of wings. They consumed every leaf, every blade, even the bark of trees. The earth itself was left naked." In Hungary, a bishop's journal recorded an entire summer lost to locusts. They came thrice. First to eat the wheat, then to eat what grew after, then to eat even the weeds. Nothing green remained. Even the graves lost their grass. Medieval kings struggled to respond. Without science or a centralized agricultural policy, monarchs were powerless. Some ordered national fasts. Others blamed neighboring kingdoms or infidels for conjuring the plague. In France, one nobleman paid a fortune to a group of alchemists, hoping they could summon a wind to drive the creatures into the sea. Instead, they only brought him disappointment and bankruptcy. But not all responses were fear-driven. Some early thinkers began noticing patterns. In parts of Andalusia under Muslim rule, scholars documented locust behavior, linking it to changes in rainfall. Arab agronomists noted that swarms often followed wet springs. These early observations would later influence Renaissance naturalists, planting the seeds of a more scientific understanding. Still, for most of medieval Europe, locusts remained the messengers of wrath. In religious texts, they were likened to the plagues of Egypt. Paintings in cathedrals showed locusts as divine punishment for greed, lust, and war. Priests used the swarms as warnings. Repent, or the sky will fall black again. And so, generation after generation, fear of the locust lingered, not just as an insect, but as an omen. By the end of the Middle Ages, records of locust swarms had become part of both historical chronicle and myth. They served as grim metaphors for judgment, chaos, and the fragility of human civilization. Where modern eyes see a natural disaster, medieval minds saw the invisible hand of divine justice or demonic spite. The buzzing of wings was not just noise. It was a warning, and in those dark, smoke-filled fields of Europe, no one felt safe. Modern locusts, a 21st century plague. In 2020, as the world's attention was gripped by the COVID-19 pandemic, another crisis was quietly unfolding in East Africa, a disaster not caused by a virus, but by wings, wind, and an unstoppable hunger. From the dry plains of Ethiopia to the deserts of Somalia and the grasslands of Kenya, billions of desert locusts swept across the skies. They traveled in swarms so massive, they could cover hundreds of square kilometers, some larger than the entire city of Paris. Within minutes, entire fields of crops vanished. Farmers stood helpless as their year's labor was devoured in waves. It was the worst locust outbreak in 25 years. Unlike in the Middle Ages, this was not met with prayer and panic, but with science and satellite tracking. Today, organizations like the FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization, and local governments use drone surveillance and real-time satellite imaging to detect the early stages of swarm formation. Swarms can now be tracked as they hatch and move, days or even weeks in advance. But early warning does not always mean early solution. The breeding cycle of the desert locust is astonishingly fast. Under the right conditions, warm temperatures and moist soil, they can multiply 20-fold in just 3 months. And due to climate change, the right conditions are appearing more frequently in more places. Unusually heavy rains, fueled by a rare climate phenomenon in the Indian Ocean, created ideal breeding grounds. What would have once been a dry, uninhabitable area for locusts became a cradle of life and chaos. Locusts thrive on unpredictability, and a warming planet has become their ally. In response, modern science fought back. Biological pesticides were deployed, made not from harsh chemicals, but from natural fungi that target only the locusts, leaving other insects and crops unharmed. Ecologists studied their mating behaviors, trying to find weaknesses in their life cycle. Field officers, sometimes risking their lives in unstable regions, sprayed targeted areas by plane or vehicle to slow the tide. But despite these efforts, the damage was devastating. In Kenya alone, over 70,000 hectares of crops were destroyed. In Ethiopia and Somalia, the situation became a humanitarian emergency. For countries already battling food insecurity, the locusts weren't just pests, they were existential threats. Millions of people were pushed closer to starvation. Grain prices rose. Livestock died without feed. In remote areas, farmers wept in their fields, knowing the next harvest wouldn't come for months. Aid organizations rushed to deliver food, but the swarms moved faster than trucks or bureaucracy. This modern crisis exposed a dangerous truth. Even in the age of drones and data, nature still has the upper hand. What makes locusts especially terrifying is their adaptability. A single swarm can contain up to 80 million insects per square kilometer, each capable of eating its own weight in food daily. Multiply that across regions, and suddenly, the swarm becomes not just a natural event, but an economic and ecological weapon. Scientists warn that this may not be a one-time disaster. With climate instability increasing, locust plagues could become more frequent, more aggressive, and harder to control. The warming planet isn't just melting glaciers, it's awakening ancient plagues. And while drones can see them and satellites can track them, there's still a limit to how much technology can prevent. In the past, people believed locusts were divine punishment. Today, we know better. But the outcome, famine, panic, loss, remains hauntingly similar. One desert locust is almost nothing. But 10 billion? That's a storm. A living storm that eats, breeds, and moves as one. And in 2020, that storm reminded humanity of something we often forget. In the grand balance between man and nature, we are still very, very small. Locust plagues, a comparison between the medieval and modern worlds. Throughout history, locust swarms have haunted human civilization, but the way societies interpret and respond to them has evolved dramatically. In the Middle Ages, locust plagues were viewed through a religious lens. People believed that such swarms were divine punishments, a sign of God's wrath for humanity's sins. This belief shaped their response. Widespread prayer, fasting, and mass gatherings in churches were common. In extreme cases, entire fields were set on fire in the hope that the smoke would repel the insects, and suspected witches were executed under accusations of conjuring the swarms through dark magic. In contrast, the modern world approaches locusts as a scientific and ecological issue. Today, we understand that these plagues are triggered by specific environmental conditions, especially those influenced by climate change. Unusual rainfall and rising temperatures create ideal breeding grounds, leading to explosive population growth in desert locusts. As a result, governments and international agencies use drones, satellite tracking, and biological pesticides to monitor and combat the swarms in real time. While both eras suffered from the destructive power of locusts, the consequences differed in scale and scope. In the medieval period, the damage was often localized. Individual villages or regions might suffer devastating famines, leading to chaos, migration, or even revolt. However, in the modern era, due to global supply chains and interconnected economies, locust swarms can spark food crises across entire countries or continents, as seen during the 2020 East African outbreak. Ultimately, the shift from supernatural explanations to scientific understanding has allowed humanity to respond more effectively to the threat of locusts, but the danger is far from gone. While we no longer burn fields in fear or accuse neighbors of witchcraft, we now face new challenges: climate instability, limited resources, and vulnerable food systems. The swarm remains the same, but the battlefield has changed. Conclusion: a timeless reminder. Whether under the flickering candlelight of a medieval church or the sterile glow of a modern control room, one truth remains unchanged. The locust is a living reminder that humanity has never truly mastered nature. Across centuries, these tiny creatures have humbled kings and scientists alike, their power lying not in intelligence or strength, but in sheer, uncontrollable force. In the Middle Ages, people knelt in fear, praying for divine mercy as the skies darkened. Today, we stare at satellite images and data maps, hoping to stay one step ahead. The tools have changed. The understanding has evolved, but the challenge endures. The difference between then and now is not the threat itself, but how we choose to face it. In the past, fear bred superstition. Today, knowledge offers us a choice: to act, to adapt, and to learn. Locusts do not come with intent. They follow nature's rhythm, a rhythm increasingly disturbed by human hands through deforestation, pollution, and climate change. So when the next swarm rises, we are faced with a question: do we fall into panic and blame, or do we rise with science and strategy? The locust doesn't care who we are, but our response says everything about who we've become.